about this work and my own work, and then we're going to move on to Nat, who will be introducing. We're very lucky to have 7 of the 14 poets here reading tonight, and many who send their apologies and wish they could be here just live too far, or and in one case are too ill, unfortunately, to come. So anyway, as those of you who come to these events of mine know, I've been making work about notorious females for, well, seriously, for at least the past 7 years. And I think that my fascination with negative feminine iconography, as opposed to the officially gorgeous, in contemporary culture or fairy tale or myth, emerged from the anger that I felt and still feel that femininity in both men and women that does not conform to the narrowest of prescribed frameworks is still massively socially unacceptable and actually actively socially punished. So what led me in particular was that I was so shocked by the fact that this is still the case. I think perhaps every generation growing up of young people feels that they can and will do the right thing to right social wrongs. And certainly when I came to London as a student, for example, one of the main issues that was around was gay rights, massive issues compounded by Clause 28, and then AIDS, and I'm just going to mention here, he's not with us, my friend who died from AIDS, Steve Hornibrook, who died in 1992, because Steve actively always courted notoriety, so I feel that he would have enjoyed this event. So I mention him when I can. And I think that we can say in some ways that those issues of sexual preference, you know, things have moved on. And I just must have had an unconscious expectation that things had similarly improved for young women, and that move from subject to object that I felt in the 1970s as I hit puberty must be easier. I thought it would be easier, and when in our enlightened times, you know, that was the fantasy of what my generation had done. But I'm clearly wrong. I think the advent of social media has made the emphasis on body image so much stronger. And there's actually almost no such thing nowadays as an acceptable, unedited image of a woman. Body shaming is par for the course if anybody doesn't like something a woman does or says. And the practices of self-harm, the condition of body dysmorphia, youth mental health, all of these things are now epidemic. And this does make me cross, and it's something that I can't accept. Margaret Atwood recently said, when talking about her sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, you know, everyone is saying, why do you think it strikes a chord now? And she said, well, fertile women are always a minority, and that fertility is currency in every culture, and it always has been. It's something, therefore, this currency is something that is therefore always controlled. And I would suggest that here, as opposed to Gilead, here now, that currency is controlled by shame, and that's what this body shaming is all about. To be shameful is to be uneven, to be heavy, to be marked, to be flawed, ugly, and crucially, for that to be unconcealed. Whereas to be good and shame, and not in need of feeling ashamed, one must be, as it says on the products, clear, luminous, beautiful, unmarked, effortless. That goes in, doesn't it? Glossy,
unaged,
flawless. So there's an awful lot, if you're going to achieve that is actually being concealed. So my dalliance with the Medusa, who I am rather in love with now, began when I read in the primordial myths. There are people here who could tell you much more about the accuracy of what I'm about to say about Greek and primordial myths. Anyway, in the primordial myths, that's before the Greek myths that we tend to know, the oldest myths of gods from those regions. In those, the Medusa had 2 sisters. And I just kind of was intrigued by that. I think the question at first was, why do weird sisters always come in 3s? Because they do. And the Gorgons, and actually another triad of sisters, the Graeae, were these 2 lots of triplets, were both born to sibling sea monsters called Phorcys and Cato, and they're the product of incest. They are ill-conceived, they are ill-begot, and they are deformed. In that they are not right. They have to be exiled. This has to be exiled, this deformity, this ill-begottenness. And so they lived out, Aeschylus says, on Clisthenes' dreadful plain, which sounds fabulous, doesn't it? So any landscapes that have appeared in these works, I'm thinking of this beautiful and dreadful plain. And I also, because there's so little written about them, apart from the fact there were 3 of them, that means I got to invent them, which is always a pleasure for an artist. And so with my 3 sisters, obviously the Medusa has the snake-like hair, but I got to give them, one the fishtail and the coral hair, and the other the crab claw, because they were attributes that their parents had, but I was able to bestow them as I wished, which actually felt quite good. So I then just began to explore making these vignettes of their lives, to imagine their lives, and it sort of seemed as the work went on, and there's also a very large series of large paintings, and the theory is, Arts Council permitting, that a much larger venue will show the paintings and the drawings and the book again at some future date. But what was wonderful was just beginning to imagine the life of the outcast, and to perhaps see it not as so appalling. And I do feel that it's very important for us to start spinning other narratives to tell ourselves and to tell our daughters and our sons. Because if you can only be the perfect image, and if the seeing of the imperfect image petrifies us and turns us to stone, then something is massively psychologically wrong. And I think that's why it can be so difficult for all of us just existing with the idea of being seen. And I'm very happy that now, I began this work a while ago, but in the meantime, with the Me Too movement and the beginnings of different questions being raised, I do feel optimistic. But as with anything, as I'm sure with gay rights and disability rights and anybody's rights, you constantly have to keep topping up, and you constantly keep having to inquire. So that's my spiel done, that's my tub thumping. I then, at a certain moment with these drawings, which I got very excited about and very attached to the characters, I began to talk to Natalie Sirett, who was writing some extraordinary sonnets, about the possibility of creating a book where not just me and my particular kind of tub thumping, but other people got a chance to contribute their own stories to this book. And there are 15 sonnets from 14 really extraordinary contemporary women poets in this book. And I am really, really thrilled to just be able to do this, for example, and there's a drawing that I did, but then there was this extraordinary response beside it, which is of course its own story. And that's the same on every single page. And so what I am going to do now is to hand over to my fabulous editor and companion in the creation of this book, Natalie Sirett. Thank you.